Going live in 2 seconds. What's up, horror fans? Pete here from the Lasser Cast. And after our Exorcist month, we were so into the whole idea of angels and demons that we decided to take a look at the first film in a sort of sleeper cult series called The Prophecy. Now, Danny, my co-host with the most over there, how many of these prophecy movies have you seen?
So I have only seen the first two, but I didn't see part two probably since it came out. It was, I think, parts two and three were direct to video, and I think it was old enough that I rented it from the video store. At least part two. I think parts two and three are excuse me, are available streaming. So because I just rewatched this, I might decide to rewatch the sequels. I know that there might have been a fourth film that doesn't have Christopher Walken in it, perhaps.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And then there was even a series, like a short-lived like TV series.
Okay, well, I did a little bit of research, and it turns out that there's 4 sequels to the original movie.
Okay,
yeah.
Wow.
Yeah,
okay.
And the weird thing is that 2 of them came out in 2005.
Okay, was Christopher Walken in them?
That I don't know. The last one came out in 2005. It was called Forsaken. So there's Prophecy 2, there's Prophecy The Ascent, then there's the Prophecy Uprising, and the Prophecy Forsaken.
Wow. Okay. I didn't realize that this was such a extensive franchise. I knew that they milked Christopher Walken for a couple direct-to-video sequels, and I had definitely seen the second one. That was at the time, if you remember, Dimension Films would always do this. From Dusk Till Dawn, 1996. This movie came out. It was made, I think, in like 93, but it came out in 95.
Right.
And
sorry, I was trying something out.
Oh.
Yeah, you're there.
And so this movie got some direct-to-video sequels, and then From Dusk Till Dawn came out a year later under Dimension, and it got 2 real cheesy sequels where they did some real scumbag marketing tactics. They advertised in From Dusk Till Dawn 2 that it was starring Bruce Campbell. And his entire scene in the movie is like they're watching TV and Bruce Campbell is on the TV.
Oh, Jesus. That's
There's
bad.
also there's this slasher movie from the 80s, I believe, called Intruder that it gained a cult following, and because The Evil Dead became very successful, when they put it back out on like Blu-ray, DVD, they would always be like, starring Bruce Campbell and Sam Raimi. Bruce Campbell plays a cop who appears in the final 30 seconds of the movie, and Sam Raimi is like a stock boy who's in the movie for one scene and he gets killed off camera. But like they get like top billing because they were the most well-known. So it was a tactic. It was a marketing tactic that they would, this is a fairly sleeper hit for a video store horror movie. Let's just make some quick, cheap sequels that we won't release in theaters. We'll throw them into the video store, and those horror fans will probably go, and hey, they liked Christopher Walken in the first movie. They'll watch the second and the third. And by 2005, though, it was a different world. I mean, I was getting into my profession. The video stores were closed. I did not see parts 4 and 5.
Yeah, well, it's interesting, right? Because this movie, I remember it being a big deal when it came out, but not necessarily like a big, it's on the news and it's a blockbuster and millions of people have seen it. But I just remember that there was always kind of trailers for it when you'd watch a video, and you'd see that this poster that's right behind me, you'd see this like poster on the box art, then you'd see it like in video stores too. I think there was a big deal about like Christopher Walken being the villain and like of a horror franchise, right? This is kind of like Christopher Walken's franchise. And surprise, surprise, Danny, this is one of those movies that I never saw. Like I never saw it on video or when it was in the theaters or anything like that. It's from 1995, which blows my mind that is almost 30 years ago at this point, right?
Yeah.
Or teenagers when this came out, and it feels like a different time. This movie feels like it's from a different time. That's for
Oh
sure.
yeah. I mean, and if you just look at the cast, I mean, my God, Viggo Mortensen at the absolute beginning of his career, with very few credits to his name, is only in this movie for about 6 minutes. I think I was counting I think he has 3 scenes,
Okay.
one each with the 3 lead characters. He has a scene with Virginia Madsen, who was coming off of Candyman. And, she's always kind of been a fairly, I wouldn't call her a big time actress, but people know who she is. She has a good career. Elias Koteas, who also great character actor, is given a chance to really be a star in this movie. And I thought he did a really good job. And I was kind of surprised that he wasn't given more, I don't want to say hero roles, but like lead performances. People of our age know him best as Casey Jones from the new I almost said the new TMNT movie, which I might go see today. I heard it's great.
Me too.
But he was, of course, Casey Jones in Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, and he would go on to play an amazing villain in the Denzel Washington movie Fallen.
Yeah.
He's a great actor. You have some other Eric Stoltz pops up. Not Patricia Arquette. No. Amanda Plummer. There's a very good Pulp Fiction element to this movie. Amanda Plummer, Eric Stoltz, and Christopher Walken are all in that movie. So this movie was made, I believe it was actually made before Pulp Fiction, maybe even at the same time, because Pulp Fiction came out in 94. And one of the things that like Miramax and the Weinsteins would do is they would make a movie and then they would hold it for a year and they would like tweak it a little bit and then release it when they felt it was appropriate to release it. So this movie came out in 95, but I think it was actually made in 93. And it's just weird that those 3 actors all are in Pulp Fiction. I don't think they have any screen time with each other in Pulp Fiction at all.
Yeah, I think you're right.
Obviously, this movie is executive produced by the Weinsteins, unfortunately, but so was Pulp Fiction. Dimension is like the horror section of Miramax.
Right.
So, but there is that connection. I couldn't stop smiling when I was rewatching this movie. This is one of those movies that you said you had never seen it. This was a staple of my, being 13, seeing this at the video store, and then like when I got to working at the movie theater when I was 16, and like the way that my friends and I hung out was like we would just hang out and watch movies, and like this was a movie that I must have watched with my friends 3, 4, 5 different times. Like I'm sitting there smiling, quoting the lines as they're coming, as the movie's going. Christopher Walken has, to new viewers, Christopher Walken is now, he's that actor who you cast in your movie to give you really that one scene. And to have him be like the main character, really like the lead antagonist, the star vehicle, the guy on the poster, it was really cool to see that. He's obviously everybody loves his voice, and we all do our Christopher Walken impressions. I feel like every line he says in this movie is insanely quotable.
Agreed.
And it was just one of those movies where it has a great cast. It's got some pretty unsettling stuff in there. We just did Exorcist month, so it's got a ton of like really cool biblical and there's some pretty good violence and gore in there. Some decent special effects for the time. Some age better than others. But then it's got the dialogue where you put that dialogue into another actor and it's fine, but you put that dialogue in Christopher Walken, just these talking monkeys, and like nobody else can say that the way he says it. And he has this one line towards the end where he tries to convince Elias Koteas to join them, and he goes, "You can eat all the ice cream you want." And I'm like, that he had to have ad-libbed that line. There's no way that was a written line. And it's a Christopher Walken line. And for those reasons, this has just been always, when you said let's cover the prophecy, I was like, yes, I get to rewatch the prophecy. And you can't see it, but I finally cleared off the section by my TV. I found my Blu-ray player.
Okay.
I have this was one of the first DVDs I ever bought. It's
Nice.
there's no features on it at all. It's in full screen, even on a DVD. It's not even in a widescreen format. And I just had such a great time watching this movie again.
Yeah, I mean, I did as well. I love Christopher Walken. I've loved him, ever since I was a child, and he always just have that standout scene. Um, it's funny because this is almost 30 years old. I'm assuming that Christopher Walken was maybe in his 40s at this point. Maybe his mid 40s. I don't know if you reached 50
Well,
by this point.
I think he might have just turned 80. So he's either in his late 70s or early 80s. So he was probably in his either late 40s or early 50s when he did this.
Yeah, early. So okay, so he's in his 40s, so he's older than us, the way we are now. And I think he looks really great in this movie. Christopher Walken now, his hair's all kind of lost its color and his face has wrinkles and stuff. But in this movie, he's got smooth skin and dark raven-like hair. And it's so funny because there's real physicality to the angels in this movie. One thing I wanted to point out before I kind of go into that is that this movie was the directorial debut of Gregory Wyden. Now, Gregory Wyden is a really interesting director / writer because he wrote the original Highlander in 1986. And then he was the creative force behind the Highlander TV series, which I actually was a big fan of. And this sort of 1990s, this early kind of 90s time, there's a very distinct feeling to everything. Everybody's trying to be badass. And in this movie, in the Highlander TV series, in the Highlander sequels that are out from this time, everyone's always wearing trench coats and everyone has long hair. And there's always random violence and sex. I was actually surprised there wasn't really any sex in this movie, but it's definitely this early kind of 90s vibe. And it's cool because it has kind of creative gore and imagery, the early 90s stuff. And I've talked about this when we did our Exorcist 3 review. I think I might have talked about this when we did Candyman, but I really love that early 1990 to 1995 time period, maybe even 1989. Because
you mentioned this also. I remember you saying this when we did People on the Stairs.
People on the Stairs. Yeah. It's just there seems to be this distinct style where it's horror's kind of evolving away from the slasher and becoming more creative and more imaginary. And this movie just fits right into that niche. And go ahead.
I'll name drop our good friend of the channel, David Weiner. He's doing a new In Search of Darkness for the 90s. And I think he's doing only the years 1990 to 95 first. Maybe he's only doing the first half of the 90s.
Yeah.
And the 1990s always get this bad rap with horror. Because it's always well, the 70s is the greatest generation of horror. You have the classics. You got your Exorcist, Jaws, Halloween, Texas Chainsaw. The list goes on.
Yeah.
The 80s, after a brief period at the beginning of the 80s where you had The Shining, The Changeling, and movies like that, it basically becomes the slasher decade.
Right.
And then basically the line that you hear is, and then Scream saved horror movies in 1996. And the more we've covered these movies on the channel, the more I'm starting to realize I really like 90s horror.
Yes.
The Prophecy was 95. In the Mouth of Madness was 94. Wes Craven's New Nightmare we covered is 94. People Under the Stairs. There's this grittiness to, and I think what happened is, a lot of these movies, the ones that we're talking about, the ones that we're praising, a lot of those movies kind of got lost because also at the end of the 80s and into the 90s, you had the worst of the franchise sequels. You had Halloween 5 came out in 89. You had Nightmare on Elm Street 5 and then Freddy's Dead come out in like 89 and 91. You had Friday the 13th, Jason Takes Manhattan came out in 89, and then Freddy's Dead came out in 93, which these are maligned sequels. And I think that people were like, oh God, because of the 80s, I think the slasher was the face of horror. And with that face looking real ragged by the early 90s,
right.
I think that a lot of critics and a lot of fans were basically like, yeah, I think we're not going to watch this scary movie because that last Nightmare on Elm Street sucked, or that last Halloween movie sucked. So who wants to watch Christopher Walken as an angel? Who wants to watch, a movie about this house that a kid gets trapped in and there's weird people in the basement? And yeah, the more we watch these movies, they have a certain charm to them. They feel like a more polished version of kind of the 70s grindhouse kind of movies.
Yeah.
In a way.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, right? Because when we really started to go to the movie theaters, when we worked in movie theaters, that's when CGI really started to blow up, and you have these really poorly made CGI horror films, right? Where the CGI is just sort of laughable at this point, right? Even back then it was pretty bad. But and I think Scream was very sleek looking. And so a lot of the Scream imitators were very sleek looking too. And you had a lot of like shiny, fancy horror movies like in the early 2000s.
And every movie box and movie poster looked exactly the same. It was a killer in the background and a young, sexy cast,
right,
of people you probably know from TV, gathered around in a circle. And that's when I worked at the movie theater. I was 16, right. 1998.
Right.
And you had your urban legend. I Still Know What You Did Last Summer.
Right.
You had Valentine. You had all these movies coming out in that like 2.5 year window that I worked at the theater.
Right.
And even as a horror fan, I was like, oh God, it's enough of these movies. Like,
yeah. Exactly. Like when I was younger, because so 1993, I would have been like 11 years old. 95 would have been 13. So, we're still in that age where it's like, oh, some things are taboo. We haven't seen everything yet. There's this sort of, like, oh, am I allowed to see this feeling still, up until that point. And this movie and these other horror movies really fit into that mold. And what's so great about it is, like I was saying, that there was a lot of CGI in the early 2000s. These movies are all practical effects. So you have the practical effects that have vastly improved thanks to like Star Wars and other big 80s movies, but then you have them in these like smaller budget horror movies where the directors can do really creative things. I mean, there's a scene in this movie where Elias Koteas is in a mine and he's looking at glyphs that were put up by angels or that they're like written in the angel language. And all of a sudden you have this scene. It looks like it's out of like a Renaissance painting or something, where it's a bunch of fallen angels just like impaled, like Vlad the Impaler style from, Francis Ford Coppola's Dracula. And it's just disgusting and disturbing, but it looks so cool, even though you can kind of tell it's a matte painting and maybe there's like one actor on an actual spike, but I love that stuff. And the thing is, we talked about The Exorcist for a while there. We did at least 4 episodes, and we often reference Supernatural. And Supernatural in itself is like a type of show and even like a type of movie that we see a lot of these days. And I think that the people that are making these shows and movies are like of our age. Like Eric Kripke, the guy that made Supernatural and went on to make The Boys. I think that he probably was like heavily influenced by this movie. Because when you watch
totally see that.
This movie is like a direct blueprint of Supernatural,
Yeah, I mean the whole idea of fallen angels, a war in heaven, you have all these things that I have been plot points on Supernatural. I also this movie, rewatching it, especially coming off of watching the Exorcist series and thinking about Exorcist 3, this movie also it shares a weird little plot point with Dogma, where in Dogma you had Damon and Affleck are angels, and their whole plan is to like get back at God by proving him wrong, and if you prove God fallible, the world will end. And it kind of feels like that is in a way the plan of Gabriel here, is to like they need to get the worst human soul that has ever existed. And if they get this human soul, then their side of the angels will be able to defeat the other side, and they could reclaim heaven. And this is like one of those like major plot points that we see in these types of things, where, you know, the idea that angels are jealous of humans.
Yes.
And that's something that I think that this might be one of the first major appearances of that trope that we would see later on.
Yes.
But it appears in Dogma, it appears in the Exorcist series, it appears in Supernatural.
Yeah.
And it's a really cool, you know, I'm not a religious person, I'm not a Bible scholar, but I really appreciate a movie like this, that it could come across as exposition, but it does take time to like build that mythos around like the angels and heaven, and then of course you get Lucifer with one of the best lines in the movie, where he goes, "But we all know that would just be a new hell, and 2 hells is 1 hell too many."
Right.
And you know, so it's really weird that like Lucifer kind of plays a peripheral good guy in this movie.
Yes.
While being the scariest and most intimidating fucking devil I've ever seen. I love Viggo Mortensen in this movie so much.
Yes. I think he gets the lead over Peter Stormare's Lucifer that's in Constantine, but I love that version too. That's such a great version.
Yeah.
But what I was gonna say, and Constantine itself seems to be even drawn more from this than from the actual comics.
Oh
the
yeah,
Hellblazer comics too. So what I was gonna say was that Christopher Walken often calls humans monkeys in this movie, and that's something that they do a lot on Supernatural. And it's always this idea of humans are just basically like animals. We're not evolved enough to appreciate the work of art that God made. And that's like the disdain that angels have for us. It's like we don't deserve what we have.
What does Crowley call Jared Padalecki on Supernatural all the time? He calls him. If Athena was here, she would yell it, but she's not.
Well, you know, and also one other thing too, we always consistently have one viewer when we make our videos, and I'm always wondering who that one person is. Like, there's more people come in, but there's always one person that's just sitting through the whoole thing. And whoever you are, let us know in the comments who you are. Like, is it Chris? Is it Megan? You know, who is it? I want to know. But anyway, going back to what I was saying, there's this kind of disdain that the angels have, and that's definitely like gone on to influence other stories where they kind of copy this, right? But I was actually shocked at the mythology in this story, because I knew there was like a war in heaven, but I thought it was going to be like a Lucifer versus the regular angels. It's usually like Lucifer versus Michael, which is yet again a thing you see on Supernatural all the time. But in this, the idea is that there's a second angel war, and that Christopher Walken's Gabriel is the one that's essentially in charge of the new rebel angels. So it's kind of like more angels are pissed off at God, and now they're trying to take on God directly. And so the whole plot of this is that there is this evil soul that you mentioned before, and that soul is so evil that essentially it'll be like used as like Oppenheimer's bomb against heaven. You know, it's like, oh, once we get that evil soul. And it's just very interesting. Like I mentioned a long time ago in this review, but I never really came back to it, that there's a physicality to the angels in this movie that makes it very interesting. You know, it makes it more distinct than something like Supernatural. They have the angels often like perched on top of things where they look kind of like crows. Yeah. And I love that little touch. You know, it can seem a little goofy looking at some points. And there's one part where Christopher Walken's sitting on top of a tombstone, and it looks like it's awkward. It's like in front of a background, like a fake background. But I just love that because it's like they are like birds. And then there's Uziel, the angel that attacks Eric Stoltz's Simon in the beginning of the movie, and he doesn't have eyes, right? And even that kind of reminds me of like bird's eyes. It's very like bird like quality to these angels.
The design of the angels, and even just the way they talk about them is so interesting. Like Elias Koteas has a scene where he says, you know, if you read the Bible, every time God wanted to get to like mass slaughter people or you know, send an assassin, he sent an angel. And then he's like, based on that, would you really ever want to meet one? And then it's like, you know, we think of angels as like the little cherubs in paintings, and it's an interesting point that, you know, angels are always like, you think angels and then devils, but would you want to meet an angel? And
yes.
It's an interesting, yeah. And I also just want to point out, it for like the last month, we keep bringing up Supernatural. I really like Supernatural, and I don't think it's a bad show. I do think it went on far too long.
Yes.
But it is a really good horror themed show that if you're a horror fan, if you have a young kid at home, you should definitely check it out. I just feel like we're always like, oh yeah, and then Supernatural did this. But
I love Supernatural. I love Sam and Dean. Dean's like my absolute favorite. If Supernatural ended,
nobody likes
by the
Sam.
5th season. Yeah, but if the show ended by the 5th season, if that was the end of the show, it'd be a fucking perfect show. Like,
oh yeah,
it'd be up there.
Yeah, Jensen Ackles is great. Crowley's awesome. Yeah, it's a good show. But yeah, I really the way that the angels are portrayed, the way that they look, like there's even that autopsy scene which gives you some info into their biology, and you're like, wow, like this is all shit that I did not expect to hear and see and even think about.
Yeah, it has Banyan from Seinfeld is doing the autopsy.
Yeah,
that kind of sets it from side.
And when Christopher Walken, I think in the scene you have on the background, is perched on the gravestone, the guy digging is Adam Goldberg from Dazed and Confused, from Saving Private Ryan. Again, like these are just like minor characters in this fleshed out cast. Now, you said this movie's streaming on Tubi?
Well, okay, so here's the weird thing. I go to watch it on Tubi, and it's just in Spanish. Like, there's no English in it, and there's no captions. So I was like, oh, I can't really watch this.
Plus, you can't enjoy Christopher Walken's dialogue if it's in Spanish.
Right, exactly. So I just ended up getting on Amazon.
All right. Yeah, so I searched for it on, like, my Roku, and it said, oh, it's streaming on Amazon. So I clicked on it, and it took me to a movie called The Prophecy. And I was like, nope, this is not The Prophecy. And yeah, it was a mistake on Amazon. So I burst open my cabinets, and I dug through, and I found the DVD that I probably bought in the 90s and gave it a rewatch. But
yeah. I mean, I loved it. I kind of wish that I owned a physical copy as well. I'm really glad that you brought up Adam Goldberg real quickly, too, because I didn't even have an idea that he was in this movie. I kind of knew which cast members were in it. But he is definitely an actor that's like of that time. You always remember him from like Saving Private Ryan. Then he has these like smaller parts in like, you know, the Dazed and Confused, like you said, and then also Beautiful Mind, right?
Oh, yeah.
But in this movie, he kind of plays this like just pathetic creature where he's just wanting to die. And I think that essentially he was going to commit suicide, and Christopher Walken like saved him and kept him. And then that transfers over to Amanda Plummer, who she's like about to die. She has a terminal illness. It just looks super fucking painful and horrible. And then Christopher Walken like essentially preserves her. And I thought that was such a cruel and horrific thing. You know, we always talk about horror movies on this channel, but like a thing like that, that's truly horrific. Like if you had to live with that feeling of terminal cancer, but you can't die, like get the relief of death.
Yeah.
And one last thing I wanted to say about that too is I'm actually a big fan of Amanda Plummer. Her and her father, I think, are like excellent fucking actors. And she was just recently on Star Trek Picard season 3, and she was this like villain that was just like chewing up the scenery. She was so fucking good, and she's got a very small part in this, but I think she's great in this too.
Oh yeah, I mean, Pulp Fiction is one of my favorite movies ever, and her role in that movie is amazing. Like even Eric Stoltz is not in this movie for very long. He doesn't have a lot of scenes, but he does a great job in the few moments he has. It's an underseen, underrated gem. I think a lot of people today, if they like see it on a streaming platform and they see that it has 4 sequels of like diminishing quality, then they will just assume that it's like, oh, the crappy franchise that I missed. You don't have to watch any of the sequels. Like, if you watch this movie, you kind of think to yourself, how'd they even make a sequel?
Right.
Not to give too many spoilers, but it's very of its time, but I think it holds up because Christopher Walken has held up. He is still a cultural icon. Like, he's still somebody that if he has one scene in a movie, he's done this for 2 decades now. There's a movie called Pool Hall Junkies where a great movie that nobody's ever seen. Few people have ever seen. And he has like one great moment in that. He's given one short monologue just to get out some quotable dialogue, and he steals it. And to have him as a lead, to have this really good cast around him, these pretty good practical effects, and this really kind of intriguing story that we never really get to, you don't see many stories like this, at least back in 95.
Yes. Yeah. And also, one last thing, I know you gotta go get your laundry and stuff too, is this kind of came out like just prior to, or maybe around the time that the Preacher comic came out, and the Preacher comic deals a lot with this type of story too, like the idea of like angels being dissatisfied, and there's like this force on heaven that's like a weapon, essentially. I mean, this force on earth that would be a weapon in heaven.
Yeah.
And it's just like I love stuff from this time period. It kind of reminds me of The Crow sometimes too when I'm watching this movie, because like the music kind of has similar music cues to the Crow soundtrack, and then all the stuff with like the angels, and they show some of them falling from heaven and stuff in this movie. Kind of reminds me of the Crow, and it's just this like really fucking sweet spot in movie history.
And the Crow was another in 1994.
Exactly.
And that you can certainly put that in horror adjacent. I mean,
right. Exactly. So if you guys have watched this video and you are a fan of The Prophecy, tell us, have you watched the sequels? What do you think about the sequels too? Because I'm actually, like Danny, kind of curious about checking out at least part 2, you know? And Danny and I are moving forward. I think we're going to start covering this show from. We also talked about watching was it the 9th configuration, or is it the 10th configuration?
9th.
Okay. The 9th configuration, which is like an unofficial Exorcist sequel too.
Yes.
But Danny, I'm really glad that you wanted to watch this movie because I thoroughly enjoyed it.
Yeah,
and
one of my favorite.
You guys make sure you keep watching our channel. Danny's always posting 30-second short reviews of movies. What did you post this week, Danny?
So I got to see the 50th anniversary screening of your favorite horror movie, The Wicker Man, not the Nicolas Cage version.
Ooh.
And it holds up. It is so fucking good. Oh man, I got to see that at IFC in Manhattan. So I posted a short recap of that, spoiler free, if you haven't seen it.
I'm jealous.
And I will be posting I have about a 40-second review of Talk to Me, the new horror movie out in theaters, and I'll probably be posting one over the next few days for the Meg 2, which has a 0% score on Rotten Tomatoes right now, which I don't know for me if that's a good thing or a bad thing. It probably is going to be somewhere in the middle.
Right. Jesus. Okay. The Meg 2. I don't know why the hell that's got 0%, but the commercials look fun.
Well, speaking of 30-second shorts, I also have one for a really great documentary that went up on Shudder right before Shark Week called Sharksploitation, about all of the movies basically about Jaws and all the movies that Jaws spawned with the shark exploitation genre of horror.
Nice.
Really cool. It's on Shudder. I have a 40-second review of that on the channel too.
That's hot, man. Good job. Yeah. So make sure you guys subscribe to the Lastercast. We are putting out multiple videos per week. There's always one with me and Danny too, talking about whatever theme we got going. So we're going to set that up soon, and we will see you guys next week.